Welcome to the lecture, Territorial Autonomy as Conflict Management Strategy in Georgia, 2003 to present, with Dr. Edward Holland from the University of Arkansas and ARISC Fellow. I'm Talene Lindsay, Executive Director of ARISC, and we're delighted to have you all here today. ARISC is an American Overseas Research Center that supports research in and about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, both in the South Caucasus and in the US. A member of the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, ARISC offers fellowships, programming, and research support. I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Edward Holland, Assistant Professor of Geography in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arkansas. He received his PhD in Georgia from the University of Colorado at Boulder in December 2012. After completing his degree, he was a Title VIII research scholar at the Kenan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars in Washington, D.C. From 2013 to 2016, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Havinghurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies and visiting assistant professor of international studies at Miami University. Fellowships while at the University of Arkansas include a U.S. Fulbright Scholar Award to Calmech State University in spring 2017 and the Cambridge Faculty Fellowship to Wolfson College 2019-20. Dr. Holland is a recipient of the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus Junior Research Fellowship. This fellowship is supported with a grant from the U.S. Department of Education. Please join me in a round of virtual applause to welcome Dr. Holland.
Great. Well, thank you, Talon, for that introduction. So I just want to open by saying thanks to Mariam and Diana, who couldn't join us today, for organizing the presentation. And I also want to say thanks to ARISC and to Talon and Amy Dobbs in particular for support of the project. I really appreciate the opportunity to devote an extended period of time this summer to this research. So let me get my slides shared and started. Okay. Okay. Everybody can see that, okay? Okay, terrific. All right. Okay, so the talk is entitled Territorial Autonomy as Conflict Management Strategy in Georgia, 2003 to present. And it builds on some work that I was doing prior to the pandemic with Dr. Carl Dahlman, who's at Miami University, and also Michael Brown, who is a former graduate student of Carl's at Miami, who finished his master's degree in geography a few years ago. Last year, the three of us published a paper in the journal Political Geography entitled The Arc of Autonomy in Georgia's Ajara. And a fair amount of what I'll talk about today will draw from that paper. But I also want to use the discussion today as a jumping off point for considering some future research directions, some products I'm hoping to get from the research fellowship, and I'll do so at the end of the presentation. Just to preview that a little bit, in particular, with this project, I'm interested in the conditions under which states modify autonomous status. And by modify, I mean either extending it, suspending it, or terminating it. I'm also interested in what I and my co-authors on the prior paper have come to view as a productive comparison case to Georgia, and that is Serbia, with its autonomous regions of Vojvodina and now widely recognized as independent Kosovo. So, we think that some of the dynamics that are at play in Georgia are present in Serbia as well, and we think that this comparison could be quite productive. Okay, so here's the outline for the talk. I have three aims with this presentation. First, this is a relatively new project for me, and because of its novelty, I want to situate the work that I'm doing in geographic context and also in theoretical precedents. So the first 2 points on this outline slide intend to do just that. In the first part of the talk, I want to attempt to answer the question, how do we conceptualize the Caucasus as a region? I'll complement this discussion of geography with a review of the extant literature on autonomy as a theoretical concept. Second, the second goal is that I want to draw out some of these broader themes in discussing the case study of Ajara. In some ways, Ajara is one of the dogs that didn't bark in the Caucasus. It's a third-tier autonomous region in the Soviet hierarchy that did not violently oppose the second-tier entity, that is the Georgian Republic and what became the independent Georgian state. The aim of my discussion of autonomy in Ajara is to really introduce some further nuance into the story and to build a case for the central role of autonomy as a territorially and politically flexible concept that in turn helps to explain the history of Ajara's relationship with Georgia over the past century. The third aim for the talk, as I've kind of previewed previously, is to spend some time to think productively about future directions for this research project and in particular the value of comparing Georgia and Serbia. Okay, so highlighting this first part of the outline, how do we conceptualize the Caucasus as a region? I think there's a number of ways that we could do so, and there's a case to be made about the region's physical geography and how that physical geography has shaped the communities that live there. In that we have linguistically, religiously, and ethnically diverse groups living on both the northern and southern slopes of the greater Caucasus range. Politically, another way to think about the Caucasus as a region, politically, or maybe more precisely geopolitically, we could think about the Caucasus as a shatter belt. And the concept of shatter belt borrows from the work of Saul Cohen, who's a political geographer. But a shatter belt is a region of interest to external powers with important natural resources, and then which in turn becomes a site of contestation among external powers and regional actors. In some ways, I think that this shatter belt concept is really informative and helpful for us to think about the events in Nagorno-Karabakh last fall. And I'd also say, what's perhaps unique and particularly interesting about the Caucasus is that the regional powers with the greatest interest in the region, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, they all share borders with the Caucasus itself. So maybe there's some productive directions there to think through. There's a case to be made by some authors for a geoeconomic perspective on the Caucasus as a region, and certainly there are some instances of this and examples of this. We could talk about most notably the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, but we could also probably make the case on the other hand that given the spillover of the tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the closure of regional borders that has been a condition for nearly all of the post-Soviet period, that might preclude us from thinking about the Caucasus as a unified area economically. And then lastly, maybe we could think about the shared historical experience in defining the Caucasus as a region. For example, of course, the legacies of the Soviet period, when the communists really worked to formalize the legislative, executive, and more broadly territorial structures that further consolidated national identity among the Caucasian peoples. That's a point that I'll come back to with some frequency in the talk below as the talk proceeds. I do want to talk a little bit more about some other ways about thinking about the Caucasus as a region, and I want to draw in particular on a 2011 piece by Richard Sakwa that was published in Europe-Asia Studies. And in this article, Sakwa is making an argument for 4 different regionalist interpretations of the Caucasus. The first is as a micro-region, and the Caucasus as micro-region privileges the local autonomies and republics of the various Caucasus states. And Sakwa in particular, in developing this example, mentions Chechnya. The second way we can think about it is as a meso-region. And this regionalist interpretation conceptualizes the Caucasus as a unified entity, even if the region has traditionally been divided between the North Caucasus in Russia and the South Caucasus, or Transcaucasus of the 3 independent states of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The third way is as a macro region, and that includes the broader geographical context into which the region fits, such as the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea. And then the fourth regionalist interpretation that Sakwa offers is the Caucasus as mega region, and this incorporates or recognizes the kind of wider territorial aggregations, including the European Union, which have interests in the Caucasus. So if we kind of try to seek to apply Sakwa's model to actual political events in the region, Russia, for example, has attempted to assert its position as a key player on the macro-regional level through micro-regional interventions. And of course, Sakwa's writing in the piece is published in 2011, so very prominent in Sakwa's mind is the August 2008 war between Georgia and Russia in South Ossetia. This approach, I like this approach, and I spent some time kind of developing it because I think it's inclusive of some of the other ideas that I've outlined previously. If we think about the Caucasus as a region, for example, the Caucasus as shadow belt. And as a geographer, I like this multi-scalar framework that Sakwa is proposing because it offers some nuanced and kind of stagnant readings of the region as a whole. And I just, before moving on, I'd highlight one more element of Sakwa's argument. Shifting from this kind of general geopolitical overview, in the paper, Sakwa narrows his focus to the Caucasus as a meso-region, discussing the viability of political boundaries. And if we think about these political boundaries in the Caucasus as an entirety, you've got places, you've got peoples like the Lezgins who are divided between Russia and Azerbaijan, living in southern Dagestan and northern Azerbaijan. There's also attempts, of course, at kind of political geographic redefinition of the region. And Sakwa here is thinking about the North Caucasus Federal District, which was created in early 2010 by Russia. And then, of course, the realizations brought about by the 2008 war that the Caucasus is a single security region, particularly when viewed from the perspective of outsiders. And despite its fragmentation, there are common political interests across some of the constituent states. So, okay. So let me, I want to build on this idea of the Caucasus as a region a little bit more. And I'd like to talk through this map just a bit in doing so. I imagine that many of us are familiar with this map, but I think in terms of laying the foundation for where I want the talk to go, it's valuable to talk through. The map of ethnic groups in the Caucasus provides an opportunity to better understand meso-regional dynamics. In particular, the complexity of the geographic complexity of ethnic settlement, transborder populations, and also critically important for our talk today, the legacies of the early Soviet decisions to extend autonomous status to some groups, but not to others. Okay, so if we look at the map, let me, excuse me just a second. Go. if we look at the map, we of course see an ethnically diverse region. Right? It's a patchwork of different colors and groups. The challenge of the post-Soviet period, those challenges in part stem from this diversity, but arguably more so from the techniques of territorial management that the Soviet state deployed in the region. So we see some instances of national congruence that were delineated in autonomous regions, and I'll talk about the theoretical implications and also the applied implications of this a little bit later. But for now, with the map, I just want to highlight a few regions of interest to our talk today. First is Ajara here in southwest Georgia. I'll speak about its history a little bit later, but of interest here is the fact that ethnically it's a Georgian region, though the residents have historically practiced Islam. I also, of course, want to trace the borders of what was the Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia here in the northwest, and then the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, roughly here. These places are important to our story, of course, because they've emerged as de facto states in the past 3 decades, thanks, of course, in no small measure to the support of Russia. But like Ajara, they were autonomous during the Soviet period. And of course, there are other autonomous regions in the Caucasus. So Nagorno-Karabakh here is the outline of that territory in Azerbaijan, and we have autonomous regions in Russia today, which comprise the national republics in the Russian Federation. And going from east to west, we have multi-ethnic Dagestan. What was during the Russian period, the Soviet period, the Checheno-Ingush ASSR. Of course, in the early 1990s, it divides into Chechnya and Ingushetia, 2 separate republics within the Russian Federation. We have single ethnic North Ossetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Karachay-Cherkessia, and then also Adygea here. I'd highlight also maybe a couple more places in Georgia that are relevant to the story that I'm trying to tell today. We have in the south central part of Georgia, Javakheti, with its Armenian population, and then Azeri populations in Krama-Kartli and close to the border of Azerbaijan. I'll say as an interesting aside, I've been reading about the Azeris in Krama-Kartli, and Christoph Berglund, in a recent piece in Europe-Asia Studies, notes that there was a movement for an autonomous region among Georgia's Azeri population in the early 1990s, but this came to naught. And this is a really interesting piece of information, given the kind of story that I'm trying to tell, and the idea perhaps that the minority groups in Georgia at that time recognized kind of the importance of the basis of autonomy for potential political organization. Okay, but in sum, what I want us to get from the map is that in the Caucasus, we have significant ethnic diversity, and some of these groups had their own autonomous regions and some did not. Okay, from here I want to go on and talk about autonomy as a theoretical concept, and I'm drawing on some of the work that was in the paper published last year in Political Geography to do so. In theorizing autonomy, I seek to go beyond a static formal analysis of autonomy and to explore the dynamic practical modes of statecraft that enliven autonomy with rather different forms of competencies and meanings. So the expression of autonomy varies significantly over time, and that variation underlies the importance of how and why states may seek to use and alter territorial autonomies as spatial fixes for restive or contested minority regions. The concept of the arc of autonomy that we develop in the paper and that I'll explore in discussing Ajara, that concept really intends to capture the changing nature of the relationship between center and periphery and national and local, while also maintaining a focus on territorialization and the operation of power through space as part of a continually emerging process of social relations. kind of more generally, autonomy is just one technique within the contemporary interstate system to grant minorities greater degrees of self-rule under a state's sovereign authority, while limiting and maybe avoiding separatist motivations to rebellion or secession, and also reducing opportunities for intervention in those areas from outside powers. I recognize that territorial autonomies kind of vary widely in terms of their meaningful local authority, how they're actually implemented. In some cases, the authority that's granted to the autonomies is limited, and it focuses just on questions of cultural and linguistic difference. But in other cases, autonomies really do possess extensive and meaningful self-rule. So I would make the case, of course, that the variety of kind of ways in which autonomy is implemented, that demands caution when directly comparing autonomous regions. And I also want to say, in the project, we're distinguishing territorial autonomies and their asymmetrical expressions of local government as fundamentally different from local units in federal states. We're not talking about federalism here. We're talking about devolution in the form of autonomous status and autonomous regions. Okay. So in analyzing Ajara and the changing character of autonomy in Ajara, this arc of autonomy, in the paper, my co-authors and I adopted a modified version of Weller's characteristics of territorial autonomies. So what does that mean? Well, this framework that Weller has developed really first kind of keys in on the dynamics of cultural distinctiveness. How does kind of cultural difference serve to define a local political community and potentially lead to the formulation of autonomy? In the case of Ajara, and as I'm going to make the case in a little bit, cultural identity cannot be read off as a static condition, right? But instead it's part of a changing self-understanding of local identities and that modify the significance of the autonomy over time. A couple other characteristics of autonomies following Weller that I want to just highlight and draw out. There are two characteristics that deal with the institutional structure and practice. The first is the legal supremacy of the state, such as the devolved rather than decentralized authority that is vested in the autonomy, and the modes of integration and representation for the autonomy in central institutions. What does that mean? That basically means, what is the relationship between the autonomy and the central state? There's a second set of characteristics that Weller's developing that describe the legal competence of the autonomy, such as the structure of local institutions and their power to create and enforce local laws. What does that mean? How is the autonomy viewed by its inhabitants in terms of the competencies and abilities that it can carry out? So we have this center periphery. If we can define autonomies as peripheries, we have a center periphery relationship that exists, but then also how is the periphery kind of manifesting its power in the eyes of its local residents? So in analyzing the implementation of autonomy in Ajara, we seek to understand whether the formal presence of these characteristics, the way that I've tried to theorize autonomy just above, is matched in the actual expression of that autonomy. Okay. So going on to the arc of autonomy in Georgia's Ajara region. First, I want to just briefly bridge this theorization of autonomy and the case study of Ajara. And I'll talk a little bit about how autonomy was put into practice in the Soviet state. Of course, there's some terrific work on territorial autonomy and its instantiation in the Soviet Ethno Federation. I'll talk through one of the kind of foundational pieces here, but there's significant literature out there on this topic. Ethno-federal institutions gained increasing importance in the USSR during its history, and especially this was especially the case following the political liberalization under Gorbachev. The state structure was built on the territorialization of ethnicity. I previously referred to the various tiers within the Soviet state. The first tier is the Union itself, followed by the second tier composed of the Union republics, and the third tier of the autonomous regions that were nested within those republics. If you think about the idea, if you've ever heard the concept of matryoshka nationalism, right? It's this idea that territories and autonomies and regions were nested within one another in this ethno-federal model. And while, of course, a case could be made that non-autonomous groups would demand similar structures and rights, that's really not how the situation in the USSR played out around the time of transition from the Soviet state. Drawing on Svante Cornell's argument in his 2002 article on World Politics, Autonomy as a Source of Conflict, Cornell really keys in on autonomy and identifies it, isolates it as a root cause of conflict in the Caucasus. And he does so, of course, by evaluating across a large set of factors that might explain ethnopolitical conflict among minority populations in the Caucasus region. And when he looks at his analysis, in 8 of the cases that he's looking at, autonomy correlates as an explanatory factor to violence. Put another way, basically, if a region is autonomous, then conflict occurred in Cornell's analysis of the Caucasus region. The only exception is Ajara, the focus of our talk today. So on the other end of the spectrum, or another maybe explanatory variable could be demographic dominance of the titular nationality for those regions or territories, but Cornell finds that this only correlates in 3 cases. So if we delve a little further into the example of Georgia and the autonomies and minorities in that country between 1987 and 2000, we could talk about Abkhazia and autonomous status in Abkhazia compensating for the group's demographic minority. We could, in South Ossetia, Cornell makes the case that autonomy played an important role in galvanizing support against Georgia's language laws and in the emergence of the local popular front. A key question that Cornell is exploring is, why was there no conflict in Javakheti, in that the Armenian region in Georgia's south? Cornell points to a lack of autonomy as a key explanation. There is a popular front in Javakheti, Javak, but it lacks a basis for legitimacy in the form of existing autonomous status. So what happens in Javakheti is that the response to unfavorable Georgian laws or the nationalizing of the Georgian state, to borrow Rogers Brubaker's conceptualization, the response to that nationalizing policies was weak in Javakheti. And so I'll key in on this comparison between South Ossetia and Javakheti just a little bit more and draw out a quote from the Cornell article. He writes, quote, "The key difference in the development of the 2 organizations, the popular fronts in those respective territories, was the autonomy enjoyed by South Ossetia facilitated the cohesion and strengthening of the nationalist separatist movement around the governmental institutions of the region," end quote. In Ajara, this exception that Cornell has identified, autonomy was not a source of conflict, but rather led to the institutionalization of Aslan Abashidze's power over the region. And that is one element of this arc of autonomy that I want to explore a little bit further, turning to the case study of Ajara. Okay, so here is kind of the way that I and my co-authors have conceptualized the arc of autonomy in Ajara. Okay. So I'll say that, kind of start off, the goals of the paper that was published were threefold. First, we wanted to provide a compact and updated account of the various iterations of Ajara's autonomy. We wanted to analyze why Georgia, the second goal was to analyze why Georgia maintains Ajara's autonomy as a nominal expression of regional self-determination, particularly in light of the unresolved status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And third, we wanted to consider whether Ajara's position currently reflects a moment of broader geopolitical importance as states move to exert continued or increased control over autonomous regions established in the 20th century. And we can talk about a number of case studies, but prominent, of course, are Crimea, Hong Kong, Catalonia, Iraqi Kurdistan, Northern Ireland, and Greenland, among others. So is this a moment where we should reconsider the way that states approach and engage with their autonomous regions? That's our kind of the broader theoretical context we're trying to situate this paper in. The arc of autonomy, as we apply it to Ajara, really intends to capitalize on what the case that we've made, or the case I've tried to make above, on the protean nature of autonomy as applied in this particular case, and to kind of develop this arc of autonomy, we see autonomy as evolving in Ajara from cultural to institutional to instrumental to nominal. And this evolution does really underscores the flexibility of autonomy as an analytical and applied concept. So to talk through some of these stages and periods, Ajara's cultural autonomy is the historical product of the Treaty of Kars, signed in 1921 by Turkey and the Soviet Union. Article 6 of the treaty stipulated that local administrative autonomy would be extended to the district of Batum, which was part of a larger Batum oblast that was divided between the two countries by the treaty. As my co-authors and I write in the paper, and following Matthias Pelkman's, from the Turkish side, autonomous status, as secured in the treaty, created another layer of protection for the Muslims who inhabited Ajara at that time, and offered also maybe the possibility for irredentist claims in the future. Within the Soviet territorial hierarchy, the granting of autonomy to Ajara was on the basis of religion was virtually unique. The only other instance of a region receiving autonomous status for religious reasons was the Jewish autonomous oblast in the Soviet Far East. Of course, the first 2 decades of the Soviet state were characterized by a broader campaign against religious practice and belief. In Ajara, this led to the closure of mosques and the proscribing of the wearing of the veil. And more broadly, the Soviets' anti-religious campaign resulted in efforts that aimed at Christianization and religious re-identification, which really attenuated any sense of unique sense of identity in Ajara based on religion, as well as the cross-border ties with Turkey. So what happens over the Soviet period is kind of the gradual replacement of cultural autonomy as secured in the Kars Treaty with an institutionalized autonomy that marks the territory as kind of simultaneously distinct and nested within the Georgian Republic. So we see an evolution from this kind of cultural basis for the establishment of Ajara's autonomy to this institutional organization as operationalized by the Soviet state. What happens next? Of course, after the breakup of the Soviet state, autonomy in Ajara was retained in independent Georgia, and then we argue in the paper instrumentally deployed by the region's strongman leader, Aslan Abashidze. Abashidze capitalized on the challenges of the transition period to consolidate his control over Ajara and then exploit the region as a territorial base. For example, he started his own political party, he forms a personal and deploys a personal militia, he uses regional institutions and economies to enrich himself and his family. To just draw out a quote on this from the paper, quote, Abashidze created an alternative power center in the country's southwest with its own mechanism of enforcement that relied on his personal militia and locally based Russian forces. As an instrumental concept, under Abashidze's leadership, autonomy facilitated Abashidze's control while the region remained formally part of the Georgian state. So that is the instrumental period when Abashidze is in control. And then, of course, we have the events of the Rose Revolution and following these events, Ajara's autonomous status evolves once again. Abkhazia at first delays the release of the November 2003 election results in Ajara. And when the results of that vote are made public, his political party, the Union of Democratic Revival, had received nearly every vote in the region in the 2003 November 2003 vote, 94.7%. So these results, of course, are met with skepticism elsewhere, and while Abkhazia threatened to separate Ajara from the rest of Georgia if the results were not recognized as legitimate. For Abkhazia, the end comes 6 months after Shevardnadze's resignation, when Saakashvili has won the presidency, and clashes between protesters opposed to Abkhazia and his security force in Batumi and on May 4th, 2004, kind of blow up into larger protests, and those protests demand Abkhazia's resignation. Eventually, over the next couple of days, it becomes clear that Abkhazia can't hang on to power in Ajara, and he flees to Moscow on May 6th. So what's interesting, of course, for us, and as we highlighted in the paper, is that Ajara remained autonomous within the Georgian state after Abkhazia's ouster. And in the last stage, we suggest that this autonomy is best thought of now as nominal. It's first delineated in 2004 law on the status of the Autonomous Republic of Ajara, and some of them, some competencies are devolved to the region, some are kept pretty securely in with the central state. So, for example, the autonomous region is limited in establishing only 4 ministries: education, culture, and sport, agriculture, finance and economy, and health and social protection. There is significant central control from Tbilisi stipulated in the Republic's constitution, as it was subsequently drafted and revised. Importantly, the constitution, laws, and actions of Ajara as an autonomous republic must conform to Georgia's constitution, and external relations with other countries are reserved for the Georgian state alone. So there's some really interesting kind of changes that are brought about after the Rose Revolution in terms of the organization of Ajara as an autonomous region. We, as part of this project and for the paper that was published last year, we conducted interviews in Georgia with academic and political elites. One quote from those interviews, I think, that I'll highlight about this kind of nominal autonomous status is from an interlocutor in Batumi, who says, quote, "Because of previous experiences with autonomous republics in Georgia, I think the perspective is that we have very weak autonomy here in Ajara because the government is scared of separatism. Before the situation in 2004, we had not autonomy, but complete local governance and independence. Now we have moved to an autonomy that is completely dependent on the central government," end quote. Another interviewee summarized Ajara's autonomy as weak. Quote from that interview: "Ajara's nominal autonomy is rooted in the oversight the region experiences from the capital, which limits local politicians and prevents independent decision making." Okay, so to kind of work to a conclusion in discussing this arc of autonomy, the contemporary form of autonomy in Ajara should be positioned with respect to 2 elements that we draw out further in the paper. First, as mentioned in these quotes above, and as discussed in interviews, as successful as Georgia's management of Ajara has been, we do not think it would have been possible without significant shifts in Ajaran identity, in the identity in the region. At the most basic level, a territorial autonomy is meant to respond to a distinctive demographic regional identity. And while kind of the cultural basis for Ajara's original autonomous status and experience in the early Soviet Union was defined by this religious component, by its distinctive Sunni Muslim population, that distinctiveness has been diminished by the increasing salience of the Georgian language as a primary basis for an inclusive secular national identity. A second really important element of our story here about this kind of nominal period in Ajara's autonomy, I think it's important to kind of position this story against Saakashvili's state-building efforts during his tenure as presidency. Saakashvili was emboldened by his success in Ajara, but clearly had less success in reintegrating Georgian territory with respect to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And a common interpretation among the interview subjects that we spoke to was that Ajara's autonomy is maintained as an indicator of the territorial form that reintegration of South Ossetia and Abkhazia could take. As my co-authors and I write in the paper, quote, the arc of autonomy provides the state with strategies for managing Georgia's other conflicts, end quote. But in practice, the actual application of this idea hasn't been fully successful and really underscores the false promise of some autonomous arrangements. Okay. In Ajara, just to kind of circle back to some of the successes of this nominal period of autonomy, reintegration with the Georgian state has generally been viewed positively, particularly if we think economically about the region's place within the larger Georgian state. The autonomous region is booming, and particularly Batumi. For example, direct investment increased threefold in Ajara between 2004 and 2012. And Batumi has been described as one of the most attractive places on the Black Sea coast. It's a key port on the Black Sea for oil shipments and other regional trade. And the city's proximity to Turkey and the border with Turkey has expanded the flows of goods and capital. If overall from 2012 to 2016, Tbilisi received about 75% of Georgia's total foreign direct investment, Ajara was second region among Georgia's regions at 10%. So, this economic development in tandem with the maintenance of autonomous status, that perhaps serves as the most credible argument to Georgia's breakaway regions for the value of reintegration, however kind of unlikely that is to occur. Okay, so I now want to move to conclusions. And I just want to step back a little bit from the case study of Ajara and make an argument about studying autonomies contextually and comparatively. I see an expansive research agenda in studying the broader relevance of autonomies to political geography and geographically sensitive inquiry. And this approach really would rest on the reframing and contextualizing of the development of autonomy as a spatial fix for governance and conflict management. The case study of Ajara underscores the flexibility of autonomy as a spatial fix, and a relationship between center and periphery can evolve dynamically, really dependent on both internal and external political dynamics within a given state. So, but again, if we see the way that autonomies have played out in actuality, autonomies in restive regions as diverse as Papua and Kurdistan and Tibet and Kosovo reflect that there's something out there in terms of a search for political status that's perhaps less than independence, but more expressive than just kind of local limited rule. Kosovo, of course, is the exception that became independent, and I build the case that Kosovo's path to independence is more having to do with a loss of autonomy rather than an evolution of it. Most autonomies are kind of a compromise that preserves the state and regional balances of power, whether or not they confer meaningful benefits to the minority group. Okay, so to kind of work toward a conclusion, given Kosovo's evolution, given as well as kind of personal interest in that country, and then also this theoretical idea of autonomy, I'd make the case for value in comparing Georgia and Serbia, and specifically the autonomous regions of Ajara and Abkhazia with Vojvodina and Kosovo. Part of the value in this approach is addressing the questions of how we talk across the Soviet and post-Soviet periods, as well as the larger realm of post-socialist states. Both Serbia and Georgia were constituent units of federal states during the communist period. They're republics and larger federations, but both also contain autonomous regions that were established to extend political and cultural rights to minority groups in a nested fashion. Serbia, as part of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, has the autonomous regions of Kosovo and Vojvodina. Georgia, of course, as I've talked about, has these autonomous regions of Abkhazia, Ajara, and South Ossetia. They each experienced conflict during the transition from communism. And that conflict, again, in both cases, is animated by opposition in the autonomous regions to the nationalizing policies of the central states and the dominant titular nationalities. At the same time, both Serbia and Georgia are home to autonomies, Vojvodina in Serbia and Ajara in Georgia, that have administrative status and longevity comparable to the regions that experience conflict, yet where no such violence occurs. So given this kind of historical precedence and the potential for territorial autonomy to animate oppositions to the central state, looking forward, this project intends to ask comparatively, why do Serbia and Georgia maintain autonomous status for Vojvodina and Ajara in light of their recent experiences with secessionism and de facto territorial loss? Are there similar rationales that have comparative value here between these two country cases? And the future project, I'll say, will likely take a bottom-up approach that engages with autonomy as a flexible arrangement from the viewpoint of local communities, and really asks if and how those living in these autonomous regions benefit from these arrangements, or how they interpret and understand them. Okay, that is the presentation for today. Talon, I'll hand it back to you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holland. We would now like to turn to the Q&A portion of our session. And with your consent, I'll turn off the recording.